Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to be filming a true crime video, the murder of Shirley Leach, because it actually happened in the town that I live in. And I'll also list the products that I use down below. So yeah. So this the murder takes place in Bury, which is in Greater Manchester in the north of England, on January 7th, 1994. A local couple were coming home from a night out at around 4 AM. They decided to stop at Bury Interchange, which is the local bus station in Bury, which I've been to many times. The people were using the toilets, and as it was 4 AM they normally close like half the toilet, so there was like one stall available. The man went to the men's toilet and the woman went into the woman's toilet, and yeah. She approached the only open stall when she went in, and she found the body of a woman. She was on the floor naked and found in a pool of blood, and she was mutilated. The woman screamed and left the toilets and instantly called police, and when the police arrived they cornered off the scene so no one could go in it, and yeah. So when they arrived they started investigations, like the investigators went round the scene to maybe look at some evidence and the surrounding areas of any signs of this victim, because they didn't know who it was or who had done this to the woman. The body was of an elderly woman, and it was so mutilated that it was hard to tell who this woman was, because they'd mutilated her body so badly that her body was barely recognisable. It was only a tiny stall, so it was hard to investigate like the scene without contaminating evidence, because it was just a toilet stall. Like, it's not much room in a toilet stall, is there? It almost took them 14 hours to identify the victim, but eventually they managed to, identify this woman. The body of Mrs. Shirley Leach. Shirley was a 66-year-old grandmother who had lived in Bury her whole life. Widowed, as her husband had died 2 years ago before this from cancer. She would spend time with her children and her grandchildren, or her neighbours, and she was described to be a very nice, kind old lady. Her family was everything to her, caring, loving to her neighbours, and she would go over to the neighbours for a drink. One neighbour, 2 children, a son called Gary and her daughter Beryl had their own children, which were Shirley's grandchildren. She had 19-year-old Darren, who Shirley was very close with. Both her and Darren shared a love for music, and Darren even said that she knew more about modern music than he did, and he was only 19, so he would know like the music of the time. they would always go music shopping together, and they would talk about the new artists, and she was just very young for her age. Darren described Shirley as a second mother rather than a grandmother. She was a very generous woman. She would help him with financial and give him some money when he needed it, because he was only 19, and when you're 19 you're not going to be very financially stable. At the time of Shirley's murder, Beryl was actually in hospital, in Fairfield Hospital. So they'd been going to visit her on just before the murder. The murder, which was January 6th, 1994, she had been out with her grandson Darren. They'd been to visit Beryl in hospital, like I said, and on the way home they decided to stop off at a pub, drink a couple of drinks, and Shirley decided to leave. It was winter, it was starting to get dark outside. It was like getting on for 9 o'clock now. Shirley had to get 2 buses home. They both got on a bus to Bury Interchange. Darren got off a few stops before Bury Interchange. Shirley and Darren said goodbye. Darren gets off the bus, waves and watches the bus leave. It was the last time he saw his grandmother. Shirley arrived at Bury Interchange at around 9:10. That night she was seen by multiple people. She was still safe and well at this point. There were actually 2 nurses on the bus that from Fairfield Hospital, where they'd visited Beryl. They were able to tell police that she got to the bus station safely. Shirley then walked to the bus stand that she would get her second bus from, as she needed to get 2 buses from her to get home from the hospital. But she actually missed that second bus, and this was the first time that she'd missed this bus, and then the first time she'd made this journey alone. She decided to wait for the next bus, which was scheduled to be arriving at the bus station at 9:40, so that means she had like 20 to 30 minutes to wait. So she decided to go to the toilet. The toilets were on the other side of the bus station to where she was the bus was going to come from. There was a low possibility of anyone seeing her go into the toilets, as the toilets were on the outside of the building. She was seen making her way to the toilets at around 9:15 p.m. by one of these nurses that had seen her earlier, and within 5 minutes of this sighting, Shirley would be brutally murdered. Her body was taken for autopsy, and the death was actually found to be strangulation. So she hadn't died from losing blood or anything like that. After she was already dead, with a smashed glass bottle that has never been found later. I'm just editing this back now, and I've realised that I cut a clip out and I don't know where it's gone, and the bit I just said probably doesn't make sense. Her body was mutilated later with a glass bottle that has never been found. That would make sense. So back to the video. Also, one of her breasts had been fully removed. They believe that the killer took it as some sort of like trophy, as murderers tend to take when they kill someone. She was covered in lots of other cuts and wounds on her whole body. There was actually saliva sample found on her body, which has been led to believe that the killer may have bit Shirley, and they'd remembered that they'd bit her and came back to her body to mutilate her and to get rid of the bite mark that was probably on her breast, because that had been taken, so they believe that's why the breast was cut off. DNA tested. There was actually two different blood samples found at the scene of the murder. And this was the 1990s, so DNA testing wasn't as high tech as nowadays. And obviously it was Shirley's blood, so it's believed blood sample is to be her killer's. They believe that she was the blood sample from the other person is from defending herself in her attack. So that's why they've got the blood everywhere. And that's a huge potential lead in the investigation. It was also found that 66-year-old Shirley Leach had been raped and sexually assaulted. The murder is thought to have happened between 9:15 and 9:20 p.m. that night, which is late, but in a bus station lots of people are coming through at that sort of time. The police think somebody had to see something, maybe someone following Shirley, someone possibly hanging out by the toilets. So the public appeals were mainly trying to find witnesses that were at the station at the time of the murder to come forward, give any type of lead or possible evidence to the police. A man named Gary O'Neill saw the news and got in contact with police because he had also been getting off a bus at Bury Interchange around 9 p.m. that night. He said he was walking in the direction of the toilets once he got off the bus, but he wasn't going to the toilets, but he was walking in that general direction, and there was a man standing outside of the toilets that night. And normally you wouldn't think too much of it, but when you know that someone's been murdered in the toilets, then you start to think about stuff like that. The police asked him to tell them a description of the man. He said the man was in his late 40s, early 50s. He was wearing a long light coloured coat, a flat hat and a green bag. But that was all he could really tell police at this point. There was also a woman who came forward saying she was in Bury Interchange around 8:30 p.m. that night, which was around 40 minutes earlier than the murder. She also said she saw a very suspicious man. He approached her and wouldn't leave her alone for a cigarette. And she didn't want to wait for the bus while the guy was around her, so instead she got a taxi home. This woman who got approached by this man and left in a taxi also gave a very similar description to the man, so a light coloured coat, a hat, mid to late 40s. So police started to feel like they were getting somewhere with these leads and the witnesses. A group of teenagers also came forward to police saying that they'd been hanging around Bury Interchange that night, not in the bus station, but slightly down the road from the bus station. So they would have seen anything or heard anything if anything was to happen. And they actually heard a woman scream, but they didn't think much of it and they didn't see anything, so it won't really help police identify a suspect, but did help them shorten down the timeline of events. An elderly woman also came to police. She told them she'd been waiting in a queue for a bus that night with a friend when they saw a man hanging around the women's toilets. He had his back to her the whole time, so she couldn't describe his face, but gave a further description of the man more than the other witnesses, saying he was around 5'7" to 5'8", and the police had one more main sighting that they believed to be the most promising yet. A young girl had been waiting on an outside bus stand at around 10:10 that night, so that was almost an hour after the believed time of Shirley being murdered. This girl said she'd seen a man walking away from Bury Interchange that night holding a handkerchief soaked in blood, and the timeline lines up with when the killer, if this was the killer, would have gone back to Shirley's body to mutilate her. As I said, Shirley's also had defence wounds, and so it's unclear whose blood that was on the handkerchief, if it was his or Shirley's. And the source did say he was holding up to his face a lot, so possibly trying to stop the bleed that Shirley had caused to her attacker. These sightings all came together to create a profile. They believe this was a white man in his late 40s to early 50s, between 5'7" and 5'8". He seemed to dress pretty well, and that's what police pretty much had. A police sketch was made, and this sketch was put all over the news. Reconstructions of both all these sightings and Shirley's last known moments alive, and they were all shown on BBC's Crime Watch. When they were aired, police received a lot of calls with a lot of potential leads. However, none of these came through with anything significant to catching the killer. In total, 700 people were actually interviewed for witnesses or being around the area, and obviously family and friends of Shirley Leach. To a halt in the case, none of these interviews really led anywhere. So they decided to do a mass giant DNA screening of hundreds of men in the surrounding areas of Bury Interchange, and they had to all give saliva and fingerprint samples to the police, and around 500 men were screened, but none of them were a match to the sample found at the murder scene. Police theorised that the killer had watched Shirley and must have followed her into the toilets, but attacked her between her getting in the stall and closing the door, so she didn't have time to close and lock the door behind her. He attacked her, he raped her, and then killed her by strangulating her before leaving her body for around half an hour, then returning with the smashed glass bottle to mutilate the body to supposedly get rid of evidence. Kind of went cold, which was terrifying for the public that lived in Bury, because someone capable of raping, killing and mutilating a woman was still out there, and there was a possibility of them striking again. Women were terrified of going anywhere, especially at night, and also by themselves. The sales of protective weapons skyrocketed because everyone was terrified of the killer striking again. Around a year after the murder, police planned a stakeout mission at Bury Interchange, hoping the killer might come back to sort of like remember the killing, but they didn't see anything. And then years and years went by with no evidence or killer found, but Shirley's family never stopped fighting for justice for Shirley. Since the murder, Shirley's daughter, the one they went to visit the day of the murder in hospital, actually developed a type of mouth cancer, which doctors had come to the conclusion that was from stress of going through the loss of her mother. Throughout this case, police have obviously checked security cameras, but as it was in the 1990s, it wasn't very good. They looked to see if there was a man who arrived at 9 PM and left at 10 PM, and he returned later on, and there was one man seen a few cameras around the bus station, and he kind of matched the suspect profile. And on one of these cameras, the suspect is seen running, which is kind of suspicious, not gonna lie. So a picture from this footage was taken, and then this was spread all over the news. This man was mainly bald, but a ring of bushy hair around his head. Seemed to have one limp arm that tended to stay by his side. So police theorised that this arm was either injured or maybe a permanent injury. And on this photo you could see the man's face, which led to a lot of people calling in and giving the same name over and over again. And the name was Peter Buchanan. So Peter was brought in for questioning. Police asked him where he was that night, and Mr. Buchanan said he wasn't even in Bury the night of the murder. A note about this man is actually he had a prosthetic arm that he couldn't move, and it just lay limp. He said he wasn't the killer, but he said the man on the security footage did look a lot like him. And the hair and the limp arm and was like what the police thought was like the man on the camera, and he was asked to give a DNA test to see if he matched the DNA found at the scene, but surprisingly it wasn't a match, which led to him being ruled out as a suspect. But the way people thought of him ruined his reputation in Bury of like being a nice person. Loads of people would shout at him and scream at him that he was a murderer. For a few years, the police had a breakthrough in the case that led to a new suspect being identified, but not Mr. Buchanan. Shocked police as they believed Shirley's killer had either moved away or died, as they expected him to strike again. But on the 18th of February 2006, 12 years later after the murder, they had their killer, but not in a way that police expected. Police were doing a routine road check in Moston in North Manchester when they found a car driving rather recklessly. So they pulled this car over and they suspected him of drink driving. They breathalyzed the driver, which came back positive for drink driving, but so this man definitely was drunk. They took this man to the police station, and one thing UK police always seem to do is whenever someone comes into this police station for any type of crime, is they take fingerprints and do a DNA test for further crimes, so they have them when they commit further crimes and so they have all that information in the database, and when they put this DNA in the database, it came up as a match for the DNA found at the scene of Shirley Leach's murder.
This man was Shirley Leach's killer.
His name was Ian O'Callaghan, and he was a former soldier, a former comb manufacturer, and now a bus driver. He was 37 now, which means at the time of the murder he would have been 25. He couldn't give police an alibi to where he was on the night of the murder, but you know, it's 12 years later, nobody can remember what happened 12 years ago on a specific day. I know I can't. But not only did they have DNA evidence, but they rolled up his name in the police database to see if he had a criminal history, and he had a very extensive criminal past, which included rape, sexual assault and indecent exposure. He was 16 when he broke into a 46-year-old woman's house and raped her in her own home in the middle of the night. At the time, and he also exposed himself to 3 siblings, which one of them was 19, but the other 2 were much younger, so that's a bit weird. And at the time of the murder, O'Callaghan was living about 25 minutes from Bury Interchange with his wife and his child. What? He denied all involvement in Shirley Leach's murder, but the evidence was way too strong for him to get himself out of. If the DNA test evidence wasn't enough, which it was, he matched all the witness descriptions that were given. Once police got the DNA test back, that indeed Ian O'Callaghan's blood and saliva at the murder scene, he was arrested on suspicion of murder of Shirley Leach 12 years later after the murder. A trial was set and Ian O'Callaghan was found guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 28 years. But this is not the end of the case. After he was imprisoned, there was a young girl that came out to police that she had been searching online when she came across an article about her murder and saw the mugshot of Ian, and this brought back so many horrible memories for her. She told police that Ian had raped her 10 years prior when she was just 11 years old. He was not just a rapist and a murderer, but a child rapist, which, you know, in prison, that's on anywhere, that's literally the worst possible thing you can be. Yeah. She had kept it a secret the whole time because she was genuinely scared that this man would kill her. This attack happened in 2001, so after the murder of Shirley. So once he got away with this murder, it's believed that he thought he could get away with anything. In his bus driver uniform when it happened, he got her alone in a dark alleyway, and she said, quote, he said to her, quote, "Let's see if you can keep this one a secret." It wasn't until she saw him when he was in prison that she felt safe enough to come forward to the police. This woman had been mentally locked in fear as her rapist had just been her local bus driver, and every time she went to the bus station she had to see him and pretend that nothing had happened. And in 2019, Ian O'Callaghan was taken to court for this crime, and he was given a further 16 years that would run alongside his murder trial sentence. This doesn't really add time to his prison sentence, as he was most likely never getting out, but it would bring some closure and justice to this